Hi everyone, my name is Aisha Esker, and today we will be discussing a variety of topics involving consulting psychology. So, I am a consulting psychologist. I was hired by a clinic in Hawaii called Champ Clinic. It is a harm reduction clinic that specializes in medically assisted treatment. So, basically, they are a dosing clinic that provides methadone to clients who are suffering from opioid addiction, and this particular clinic is utilizing a harm reduction model. What that means is that they cater to a specific group. This is not an abstinence only style clinic. They understand that individuals will probably be dealing with addiction issues, possibly continuing to use illicit drugs, and within that framework, they are providing medically assisted treatment as well as counseling services. So that's the kind of organization that I was hired to consult for. So let me just give you a little bit of background in terms of what a consulting psychologist does, why they're hired for these sorts, for any organization, what's the reasoning behind it. So, a consulting psychologist has specialized in a variety of different areas dealing with organizational structure and organizational health, essentially, basically, how to have organizations running optimally, and then providing consultation services so that those organizations can implement change or provide the best services possible. So, a lot of times, consulting psychologists are hired because the organizations realize that they might not have the skill sets to implement change, for example. Maybe they're good at other things. Maybe they make an excellent product, or they're great at teamwork or whatever. But when it comes to implementing change, they might need to have an outside person come in. And there are benefits to having someone from the outside come in because that person might be less biased. Obviously, they're not going to have the same emotional attachment to the industry or to the business per se, and because of that, they are able to provide information that would provide solutions for that business without having the same kind of attachment. And the main reason that you would hire somebody who is specialized in this field is because they would have an awareness, they would have the technical knowledge, and also an awareness of the literature that is providing best practices for an organization within the field of, say, modifications to the organization structure, knowledge base, process, culture, technology. There are all kinds of different areas that a consulting psychologist might become involved with, or is hired to produce solutions for an organization. So basically, they are able to provide the technique or intervention that's going to work best for that organization. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later in terms of how to implement change within an organization within its existing culture. So that's actually one of our topics that we'll be discussing. So now I already gave you a little bit of a brief history. I'm going to provide a few more details in terms of this business. So this is a family-run business, and it's been in business for 32 years. The owner is an Egyptian national. This will come into play a little bit later on in our discussion. He actually has several businesses in the state of Hawaii that are very successful, all in different areas. So he's not specialized in healthcare, but this is what he uh, regards as his legacy business. So he feels that because this is almost like a charity for him, although it isn't for-profit business, so I want to make that clear. That's also going to come into play later on in our discussion. But This is something where he is providing services to people who are in need. One, they obviously have opioid addiction, but because of the model and also the fact that this particular harm reduction clinics tend to cater to populations that are often street based because they're in the midst of their opioid addiction. Oftentimes they are having financial difficulties, they might not have their benefits in line. And so this is a business that really caters to um, people who are underprivileged. For the most part, not every single client falls in that category, but a lot of them do, I would say 80 to 90%. So this is considered his legacy business in a sense that, this is something that he takes a lot of pride in. He's very emotionally attached to this business as well. And I think that's going to um, play into some of the topics that we're going to be discussing as we go along. So a few events occurred in the last 18 months, which are behind, part of the reason that I was hired for this particular consultation job. So about 18 months ago, they started to notice a drop in their client numbers. And it was happening month by month. It was pretty dramatic. And by this point, uh, they had lost a significant portion of their client base. And, they wanted to understand the reasons why. They did try a lot of internal fix up solutions, whatever anybody could think of. Certain issues were identified in terms of performance gaps with the staff, but they were, there was a lot of staff turnaround in that 18-month period. A lot of complaints were coming in. There were governing organizations that had received complaints. And so that was, legal issues were starting to come up. And so all of these were red flags that something major is going on within the business, and that the quick fix kind of solutions like incentive programs and recruitment efforts, none of that was working. And so they knew they had to call somebody in who could look at this from a different perspective, or at least with a knowledge base that could actually provide solutions outside of whatever they had already tried. And so for that reason, I was hired. So the way that we operate, what our team does in the beginning, we do a lot of interviews and surveys, and we are also looking at statistical information. We're doing analysis, historical analysis, comparative analysis in terms of other businesses nationally that operate under the same model, and trying to see, what is going on. There's a lot of information that comes through those interviews and feedback forms. And what we're really trying to figure out are, what are the underlying values? What are the underlying goals? What is happening underneath the surface? Because on the surface, you can see what's happening. They're losing clients. People are complaining. But what's going on underneath the surface? Structurally, there's something happening. And that's what we're trying to glean from that feedback and the information that we're getting. So one of, I guess, the key factors, there was sort of a linchpin event that happened about 18 months ago. Like on the dot, you could actually look at the data and see when the drop started occurring, when the complaints started coming in. 18 months ago, they had a staff member who was the manager essentially, who was, I guess, in a gatekeeper position in terms of how, in terms of interactions with the clients and the staff members, and he was excellent at his job. And he was sort of the heart, so to speak, of the company, and many people spoke fondly of him. Unfortunately, he passed away, and it was almost to the day of that event happening that you could just see the drops in terms of client numbers and in terms of complaints coming in, because the service that people were receiving was noticeably different. They had a fair amount of difficulty in terms of replacing him. I don't think that he was really replaceable because of all of the different things that he did, but there were major performance gaps that were exposed. He was kind of a buffer for a lot of the problems that were existing in the company. And he protected those things from sort of coming to light in a sense, like they were not creating the same sort of problems because he was in the background sort of helping. When he was gone, everything got exposed, and that's the reason that it just became so noticeable. And that's also the reason that they were seeing so many drops um, in clients. And so, you know, the issue stemmed from that, like I said, linchpin event. That was a major event that occurred and sort of put the company into turmoil. But the underlying issues are what we were after, because in a way, because they got exposed, now we do have to deal with them. There was no way to kind of continue a sort of cover up in a sense. And and so what happened was, in that initial investigation, we learned a variety of things. One of the main issues that we realized was the significant factor behind all of the complaints, behind all of the performance issues, staff performance issues, etc. All of it was affected by leadership. Leadership was the overall topic, and that's the overall topic that we're going to be discussing today. Within that topic, there are a number of subtopics that are actually related to your textbook and the modules in your course. So, within that broad topic of leadership, the first topic that we're going to be discussing, this is first subtopic, I guess you can call it, is understanding leadership potential and choosing the right person for the job. This is from Module 5, Chapter 16. And the second subtopic that we're going to be talking about is leadership impact on for profit organizations, and when you have toxic leadership, how that can affect a for profit organization, the repercussions that can occur. And this is from Module 6, Chapter 19. Okay? And the third subtopic is leadership in healthcare and how this subfield is impacted by toxic leadership. And this is from Module 7, Chapter 23. And then the fourth subtopic we will be discussing is choosing the right solution for the organization based on the culture that is existing. This is from Module 8, Chapter 26. So let's start with the first topic, and I'm going to provide some advice and solution options based on current literature, and I'll mention that as we're going along. So the first topic is understanding leadership potential and choosing the right person for the job. So I chose this topic because we started off with an investigation, as I mentioned, and it involved researching the staff and gaining, a lot of feedback. And so part of what we wanted to understand from this feedback are those underlying goals, like what was underneath a lot of the decisions that were being made in terms of how this particular leader was chosen for the position, because that's going to expose some things in terms of culture and organizational structure, and how decisions are made in the company. And it will provide information in terms of the values and goals that are actually implemented, not the surface values that are promoted, but actually what's going on underneath, behind the scenes, so to speak. So in this case, what we found out in terms of how this individual was hired, this position sort of fell in their lap. They were not hired through a hiring process. They were already working here. They had worked here for about 8 years, doing well, within their position. And a crisis had occurred in the company where the former director had to step down, and this person was put in that position. And according to Leger et al., this is a study that was done in 2025. so very recent. Often organizations do not hire the best person for the job, and that's for a variety of reasons. So Leger et al. Notes that in this particular case, well, notes in general, that what happens is that longevity and seniority are often the most common reason why a person is hired, and that does not necessarily translate into that person having the best skills. They might have been there for a long time, or they might have been there for the longest time compared to the other employees, but it doesn't mean that they're a good leader. And so in this case, that individual was the longest, I guess, standing employee amongst the staff, and they had been doing well in their position. I believe they were an intake counselor, primarily initially, and by being there, the longevity as far as the underlying values that the organization is noting, um, is that it points to loyalty. Leger et al. Notes that when organizations uh, hire based or place people in positions based on seniority, what they're really saying it is that this individual is loyal to the company. And that's one of the reasons, that's one of the underlying values that they are being hired for or placed in that position. But again, it doesn't mean that they have the skill sets that are appropriate to a leadership position. According to Peter and Hull, this often occurs in organizations that have a preference for hierarchy. And this particular organization had a definite belief that hierarchy, should be in place, and that that's the only way to run an organization. And again, this does not translate, according to Peter and Hull, this does not translate into any particular leadership skill. Just because a person has been there for a long period of time, and is showing loyalty to the company because they've been there, it usually actually is translating in terms of how leadership is looking at that individual, that this is a person who is not necessarily a good leader but a good follower. Peter and Hull note that leadership often rewards good followers, yes men, individuals who are not going to rock the boat and not go against whatever the C-suite comes up with, the ideas and concepts. They're never going to say no. And that doesn't mean that they're a good leader, because they're probably not a good strategist. They might not be willing to provide that sort of input. And you want somebody who is able to do that. And Peter and Hull note that individuals who are sort of moved up in the hierarchy, as was done in this case, they tend to be promoted to the point of incompetence, and that's kind of what happened in this situation, where leadership skills were simply not present. They did not have the ability to lead the team. They were also not motivated to do that. Um, we'll talk about that in a second as well. But basically, this is Peter and Hull explained that this is a very common occurrence in organizations that prefer hierarchy, that people keep moving up the ladder. They're not the right people, but leadership likes them because they are easier to get along with. But it does not mean that they have skills that actually translate into being good leaders. And that was the case. That was what we were seeing, as far as the staff surveys were concerned, and even we had a lot of comments in terms of the customer surveys and performance. And so at that time, for quite a few years, going on like 20 years almost, most of these problems were ignored, and they maintained this position. Edgar, from a 2016 study, they furthered this argument, that basically leadership, top suite leadership, favors certain traits. And that's what we were trying to look for in the underlying decisions that were being made as to why this person was placed in this position in the first place. Um, there's certain beliefs or stereotypes that are exhibited in the decisions that are being made. And Some of these beliefs can be things like age, displays of confidence, displays of subservience. And so top leadership will make note of these factors and feel that these are the factors that, this is the person that should be promoted. And in this case, some of those did play into this decision. So this individual was chosen because of, like I said, seniority, but also in the interview that we did with the owner, he said that she was the oldest staff member, just amongst the staff members. She was married, but she had no children, and that was a particular point that he wanted to make because he said that she's not going to have to run out in the middle of the day because her kid is sick or fell or something like that. She's not going to have those sorts of issues. And she is somebody who is able to do her job well, the job that she was currently at, which was an intake counselor. And those were the factors that he was looking at. And like he mentioned before, loyalty is one of the major values, and he feels that she had put her time in, and so for putting the time in, that was the reason he felt that she deserved the position. So none of the skills that really go into making a good leader were even you know thought of. Nobody even thought of those things. So from a biblical perspective, um, we look at a good leader from the perspective of being a good leader is a person who is also someone who can serve. So from the perspective of servant leadership. So according to Scripture, an ideal leader is one who is best able to serve, and that supersedes all other factors. So in Matthew, we're told, whoever wants to be great amongst you must be your servant first, and whoever wants to be first must be your slave. And so, what that means is that true greatness, as far as a leader is concerned, comes from their ability to provide service and to have the heart and humility of someone who is able to serve selflessly. And their ultimate goal should not be to seek power or position, but rather to serve the best that they can. So, from a biblical perspective, those are the factors that help. Those are the traits that make a good leader: the ability to serve, have humbleness, and to do what's best for the group. And like I said, the qualities that this person was hired for really had nothing to do with how they were going to serve the clients or serve the staff, but possibly maybe how they were serving possibly the ego of the owner, that they were, the least argumentative or whatever he felt was important. Okay, so now what is the solution for a situation like this? So, the solution, in terms of how do you hire a leader, how do you go about that process? You have to develop competency models that reflect the specific requirements of that job and the goals of the organization. And there has to be a process to this. Having something just fall into somebody's lap because they're the oldest person or they've been there the longest isn't the best way to hire a leader. And this was the case in this particular organization, that it just showed that actually the least competent individual was placed in a position, or the highest position. And there were subsequently a variety of problems that came from that decision, and that eventually started to impact the business financially. So you want to be able, if you are picking from within your group, another solution to this, let's say you have to pick from within your group, you can't really start a whole process of recruiting. This was kind of the situation here, that they had to instantly put somebody in the position of director. You want to seek somebody who has good predictors of future leadership, they should already be showing signs that they are able to work with groups and manage groups and handle not only their own work, but get along with everybody and show good customer service and have some strategic understanding of, how the organization works and putting the organization first or above their own personal goals. And in this case, they should have skills such as adaptability, the ability to learn and grow and to have resilience. So these are things that you would want to look for if you're hiring within your own organization. It doesn't necessarily mean that the person who has been there the longest should automatically inherit the position. Okay, so now let's talk about our second topic. This is in regards to toxic leadership and its impact on for profit organizations and what are the business repercussions that can occur. So, we did, like I said, a lot of feedback. Our main form of feedback was 360-degree feedback, where you get the perspective from all different sources from above the individual in terms of, who is in rank above them, as well as their peers, and in this case, also the customers. And we did surveys and interviews and so forth. And there were, from this, we gleaned a lot of signs and flags that pointed to toxic leadership at play. And the truth is, some organizations simply don't know how to deal with that. And this was one of the problems here, is that they didn't know how to handle toxic leadership traits. And I'll get into that in a second, a little later on. So, in terms of repercussions, what can happen with a business is toxic leadership costs organizations money. And the way that it costs them money is in their dysfunctional behavior. So, it reduces productivity, it decreases employee performance, increases poor work ethic. There could be legal fees incurred and other expenses. And all of those things happened here. It was a situation where there were performance issues with the staff. Staff was experiencing low morale and, you know, low satisfaction. There was so much turnaround just in a short period of time. The people couldn't be retained, and they kept citing the same thing, that they couldn't work with this person. And clients kept leaving, and they kept citing the same thing, that they just hated coming in here because they were getting berated and verbally attacked, and there were just all kinds of issues that were stemming from this toxic leadership. And it was now the repercussions were affecting the bottom line. That's the trigger that caused the owner to become so concerned. You should have been concerned prior to that, I would say, because of the customer service issues and performance issues with the staff. But it really took just seeing a sudden drop in the clientele, to actually feel that they have to do something about this. So, according to Wohler et al., which is they did a 2022 study. Toxic leaders can contribute to creating an unhealthy environment, primarily seen in their subordinates and peers. So you see it in the surrounding people. And you'll see it in the performance, and they show signs of stress. Individuals show low job satisfaction, low group morale, and poor retention. And like I said, all of those factors were existing. Another thing that was happening was high level of absenteeism. People would come, they just come in and leave in the middle of the day. They were not being managed. They would get into fights with the director and then just walk off site. And there was just a high turnaround of staff. We were not able to retain people in this organization. I guess 3 months was like a very common number, so they hadn't even completed their probationary period, and they were leaving and citing the same problem, that they just couldn't work with this person. It was affecting their mental health and physical health. People, were having strokes and heart attacks, and it was just, they were relating it to the stress they were feeling at the job. So according to Rizani et al. In a 2022 study, Another effect of toxic leadership, as far as the staff is concerned, is an increase in deviant employee behavior. And that can absolutely impact the performance, organizational performance, on many levels. But this was seen in a variety of ways. So, not only were counselors not doing any of their work, they weren't seeing their clients, they were, kind of blowing off the paperwork. There were all kinds of infractions in terms of medical compliance and the way things were supposed to be done because there was a complete disregard for rules. This then became an issue because health organizations who are monitoring this kind of a business, the HHS, they started calling, they started sending in complaints because things were happening that they were noticing, and uh, it was stemming from some sort of problem, deviant behavior within the organization, not only by the director, but also everybody else started to feel like, I guess, they could get away with stuff. And I kind of mentioned this in the beginning where I said that businesses like this, and we noticed this in the national reviews that we were doing, businesses like this have a very high proportion of deviant behavior seen, um, and possibly the reason for this could be that a lot of them they come from lived experience. They've had, um, you know, possibly they've had previous experiences in jail, or they have drug experience, or whatever the case may be. So whatever those tendencies that maybe had been suppressed, or had not been working in the regular world setting, when you create an environment like this, a toxic environment where an anything goes kind of wild west environment, all of those tendencies can now come out. And so you see deviant behavior playing out in a variety of areas. So, according to Rosani et al., one of the reasons that you'll see an increase in all of these factors is that people start feeling that this sort of behavior is tolerated because they see that the behavior is tolerated in the leader, and so therefore they can get away with it too. And that's kind of what was happening, and that's what we saw in a lot of the feedback and information, especially when they were when we were talking about just complaints that were coming in, because complaints were coming in about this individual, but it was also coming in about other staff members and how they felt, I guess, that they could kind of get away with everything because nothing was being monitored. And there was sort of an interesting factor. This was it's going to come up in our next study that I'm going to be talking about, in the Abdelalim and Zaid study from 2023. Toxic leadership traits go unnoticed by top leadership. And part of the reason is employee silence. And so, in a study that they had done with health organizations, with nurses, what they found out is that if the employees feel intimidated by the supervisor, that they are less likely to talk. And what was happening in this particular business, there were a couple of things that were happening. Some of the employees that did speak up against it, it became a shoot the messenger kind of a scenario, that they became part of the out group, so to speak. And so you have this in group and out group. And so the in group was kind of given rewards. In one circumstance, the director would provide lunches, like she would buy lunch or donuts or whatever to her favored people. These are the people who didn't speak against her or didn't complain. And then the people who would complain, they wouldn't get anything. And so it was noticed, obviously. And then this affects group morale. And then when they would, complain further up the ladder, things were not being done. So understandably, it was causing this kind of toxic environment was causing a lot of turnaround. And people were leaving citing that they just could not work within this organization. So from a biblical perspective, a person, organization, or an organization will prosper if they abide by the expectations of good Christian behavior. If an individual is showing signs of not caring and not caring for their neighbor, for a variety of reasons, self agenda is one, or a lack of emotional awareness, perhaps, um, that they are going to see results based on the reactions of others. And in Galatians, we are told, and let us not grow weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. So we're expected as Christians to take the right course. You know, when there's a decision to be made, should I take this action or take that action? We're expected to reason it out and take the best action. You know, that's going to produce some kind of good. We are supposed to fight the urge or tendency to take any kind of deviant action or behavior. And in this case, that was not being done. And what we're told is all of our good actions are going to come out. You know, this will eventually reap that harvest. And so we have to kind of maintain our goal of being good Christians and abiding by good behavior. And in this case, that was not happening. And what was the actions that were being reaped, they were now going to come back, and they were coming back in terms of complaints and in terms of other organizations who were monitoring, saying, hey, what's going on over here, this all of this stuff, and also the financial losses. It was all coming to light because bad actions had been taking place, and they had lost the incentive or motivation to do good. So what's the solution for a situation like this? So the main thing that you want to be able to do for an organization is to create a safe work environment that encourages and promotes open communication, as well as eliminating toxic leadership traits and behaviors. So our solution was to provide the 360 feedback. There were no performance reviews being done at this organization for years. The benefit of 360 feedback is that it's anonymous, and it can help create a safe space for employees to provide their feedback in terms of how a person is performing as a leader. And we have employees that have great ideas. We have clients that have great ideas in terms of how to improve services. So we need to have an outlet, a safe way for them to communicate. Another thing that you can have is a suggestion box. Now, they do have a suggestion box. They had a suggestion box. What was crazy was that the director had the key to that suggestion box, and so she would remove suggestions and complaints about her. And so there was a situation where there were no checks and balances. So you need to have a clear line of communication with top leadership. They need to provide performance reviews, and a 360-degree feedback is an excellent way to do that, so that people have a way to communicate and explain what's going on without feeling that there are going to be repercussions. Okay, so the next topic that we're going to discuss is leadership in healthcare organizations. This is from chapter 23. And so the reason that I chose this topic is because this organization is a healthcare organization. It's a healthcare provider, and it serves a specific demographic, underserved and vulnerable people who suffer from opioid addiction, and they are financially underprivileged, and a lot of them are homeless. So it's the majority of the clients have a lot of different issues that puts them in a position of being particularly vulnerable. So it's actually almost like a subfield of healthcare, because it's not like a surgeon's office or something like that. You're dealing with a very particular demographic of the community. And so the issues that are going to come up in terms of toxic leadership and how that plays out within healthcare are significant, and can really impact a client's health and ability to receive care. So according to LeBreg, from a 2021 study, toxic leadership in healthcare can significantly impact marginalized people, and this particular demographic would be considered a marginalized group. Oftentimes, they don't receive great health care even going into the emergency rooms because they might not have health insurance, or if they do have health insurance, they are not going to probably be given or requesting specialized services. They're not going to have um, the top rated health insurances where they can kind of make a lot of money from these individuals, and so they often feel mistreated in those environments, and that's a terrible reality. But because this clinic specifically caters to this group, they should be more sensitive to those kinds of issues. So according to LeBreg, this kind of behavior, toxic leadership can perpetuate this behavior as such that it infects the behavior of staff members towards underprivileged people. And it comes across as poor customer service, complaints, low recruitment, and retention of clientele. All of these factors existed in this organization. And the issues that were affecting patient care eventually started having legal ramifications because some of these individuals had families and had people who, when they had been mistreated, were able to actually put in complaints and say, look at this organization, something is going on. My person could not receive treatment, or they were kicked out of the clinic, somebody yelled at them, and they couldn't receive their dose. And that's a major problem because now you're affecting somebody's health and their ability to receive treatment. And so that's why all of these other governing organizations, the toxicity that was sort of contained was now the effects were being seen, and people were complaining at a much higher level. And again, the owner had to take responsibility and look into what was actually happening. They could not ignore these issues, especially because the legal ramifications could affect their accreditation and could put flags on the organization. And it can cause, because there was a lot, like I said, deviant behavior was going on. If some of those factors had been investigated, they could shut down the clinic for some of these infractions. So a lot was happening. And like I said, we mentioned this before, that recruitment and retention of staff is one of the first areas that LeBreg et al. Um, mentions that you're going to see, and this was happening here. It was an impact of around like a 70% turnaround in staff. It's kind of unheard of, and a 40% reduction in overall clientele in a relatively short period of time. In the next study, according to Armitage, this is a 2015 study, that there are signs of toxic leadership. So Armitage notes toxic leadership in healthcare are often is seen in the form of managers or supervisors who are intimidating. They threaten, they shout, they have mood swings. They define the office ambiance for the day, meaning if they're in a good mood, well, then everybody's safe. And if they're in a bad mood, well, it could come out in any number of ways. And so everyone's sort of walking on eggshells. And it produces a tremendously stressful environment. Armitage notes that there are patterns of conduct that can be seen. So, for example, they give these individuals, the toxic leaderships, they all often have fair seeming agendas or noble seeming agendas. But in fact, it's a self-serving agenda. So they'll promote certain things, trying to act like they have some amazing thing to promote, but in actuality, it only serves them. They can pit in-group members against out-group members. I kind of mentioned that there was an in-group and an out-group, and there were fights that were happening even within a relatively small group of staff members. And some of the toxic behaviors might be like demeaning an individual, mocking or blaming others, ostracizing or disarming employees. So these are all behavioral characteristics that Armitage notices, and we saw all of those things come through in our 360 feedback and interviews with people, because so many staff members were feeling frustrated and harassed. So, an example of a twisted vision or this fair seeming noble vision that this individual had. So, they once said that okay, so what they had noticed, what other staff members were complaining about, is that individuals would come in and they would get turned away on site, and so then they were having recruitment issues. They couldn't get new clients, and so when questioned about it, the leader said that, oh, I tell them that we don't accept their insurance. And the reason that I do that is so that you guys have less paperwork. So I'm making your workday easier because you'll have less to do. And that was their noble vision, so to speak. So basically, they would have less paperwork. And in the end, in terms of how many clients were in, they didn't like having a lot of people in the clinic as far as noise and all of these other issues. So they were at the gate stopping people from coming in, and they were presenting it to the staff as, "Oh, I'm helping you guys. We'll make our day easier. Who cares about, more people coming in? There are enough people at the clinic," or whatever. They were, had all of this fair seeming ideas as if that was going to help people, but in fact, it was hurting the organization. And it was self-motivated because they didn't want to do the paperwork for all of the new recruits that might have come in. So Ofei et al. In a 2023 study explains that the toxicity will express as a lack of concern for subordinates and patient well-being, and all of the behaviors that the toxic leader displays will reiterate the belief that they don't care about patients and staff members. And that's absolutely true. We heard that over and over again in the client complaints. And she would say that, she would yell that, "I don't care, get out of here." Whatever those complaints were about things that had been said, it just perpetuated this belief that this person does not care about clients' well-being or a staff member's well-being. They were lacking um, empathy on all kinds of levels. And, there were major factors that were showing up in terms of how they were operating within this business. So, poor leadership in a healthcare organization, according to Ofei et al., increases costs, reduces efficiency and effectiveness, and causes dissatisfaction among staff, and ultimately results in lower patient satisfaction and care. And that 100% was happening in this organization. Um, Long-term clients were being yelled at and belittled, and eventually they just stopped coming, and they stopped seeking treatment. So they were not able to even get their medication. Who knows what happened to them? Did they go back onto street drugs? What were the health repercussions in terms of the community? So this kind of toxic leadership within a healthcare organization can affect community health, and drug abuse in this particular area. There are all kinds of repercussions that toxic leadership can have within a healthcare organization. The other issue that was occurring is, recruitment was low. Part of the reason was because of poor word of mouth. Once a lot of the people, they live in these sub communities within the homeless population. So if they've had a bad experience at this clinic, and by the way, there are only 2 clinics that provide methadone in this on this island. So if they have heard that, oh, so and so was yelled at and they threw them out of the clinic and they can't deal with that person, even if they wanted to receive treatment, this possible individual who might possibly be seeking treatment, they're not going to, because they don't want to go through that experience. So there was terrible, the recruitment efforts in terms of incentive programs and all kinds of stuff nothing was working, because the word of mouth about how difficult it was to come to the clinic, dose at the clinic, deal with this person, was impacting all of the efforts. And there was no way for any kind of positive effort to actually make a dent. And like I said, this was eventually coming out as complaints that were going to much larger governing agencies. So according to Ofei et al., it put in another way, leaders who are toxic cause significant harm to individuals as well as organizations, and it impacts, eventually will impact the viability of the organization, and the bottom line, which is exactly what was happening in this particular case. And it's the reason that I guess was the trigger for, some positive change to occur, is that finally somebody needed to wake up and do something about it. So from a biblical perspective, um, we're expected to take care of the sick and the needy, and to not have personal, self absorbed, or deviant agendas take hold of our personality. According to Proverbs, whoever despises his neighbor as is a sinner. And but who is blessed is the person who is generous to the poor. And in this case, as Christians, we are supposed to address these issues when we see the innocent or the sick or the needy being mistreated. We're supposed to step up and do something about it. We can't just turn and let it happen. So we have a duty to our fellow man, and especially in the healthcare industry and in a healthcare organization, um, they have a duty to serve. That's part of the credo. So that was not being done in this organization. And so, from a Christian perspective, it was operating in sin essentially, because they were not taking care of the sick and the needy. And that's, essentially the demographic that they deal with. So, what's the solution for this kind of a problem? So, our solution was to first identify the traits, and behaviors um, that were, being exhibited. What we believed is that there were underlying personality issues, and emotional intelligence issues, because we were seeing examples of a lack of empathy, a lack of motivation, a lack of being able to see how behavior was affecting other people, inability to regulate emotions, and an inability to um, pick and choose how to behave in any given situations. All of this was pointing to issues within the area of emotional intelligence. And like I said, certain personality factors that may be at play. Um, and so this was being exhibited as toxic leadership traits. So our first solution is to identify those, and we did that through a series of testing. We tested emotional intelligence, the Baron test, and a variety of tests. We had a whole bunch of testing that was done, and just to see where they land in terms of those parameters, and what are the issues that they need to work on in terms of training, so that we can actually see how we can improve the outcomes for the organization. Okay, so the last area that we're going to be discussing is how to choose the right leader and create the best solution for an organization within the culture that is actually existing. How do you find solutions that are going to work in the culture that is existing? We have to do an investigation of the culture. So, the reason that I picked this topic is because it seemed over a period of time, as we were doing all of this investigation, that so many of the problems were not being dealt with because there was an existing toxic culture from the point of top leadership. So a situation had been created where this kind of a person could exist. The problems that were happening could fester and continue for so many years. So it's important that we looked at organizational culture. So, according to Penir Selavam and Balaraman in a 2024 study, um, they point to the fact that organizational culture is the primary factor that needs to be looked at for situations like this. And any missteps in shaping organizational culture from the beginning, from the onset, can impact the ability for that organization to attract and retain valuable talent, which we were seeing. Any good person who wanted to do good, who wanted to abide by the rules, could not survive in this organization. And, for any ability to retain clients and recruit clients, according to Panir Selavam and Balaraman, is going to be based on the culture of the organization. So, in this case, top leadership, from all of the different investigations, we found top leadership had certain values. They valued subservience, they valued agreeability, they didn't like anybody arguing with them, they preferred a hierarchical system, they were not particularly fond of teamwork, they valued seniority. Um, they were not concerned about actual leadership skills. They just wanted the leader to basically be a yes man to whatever they wanted, basically to make it easier on themselves. And they weren't really concerned about what was happening at the lower levels, in the frontline situations. So according to Akinyele and Chen in a 2024 study, they note that top leaders, regardless of their intentions, regardless of what they claim, they can create and perpetuate toxic cultures through their actions via permissibility and a lack of transparency and trust. And that was occurring in this organization. So in this case, there were a lot of complaints that came in throughout the years, and they were ignored for decades. There was a permissible environment that was created at the top. So problems were ignored, and they were ignored up until finances became an issue, which points to the fact that the true values of this organization, the true values of the owner, had to do more with finances than actual customer service, despite what was, you know, uh, being claimed. Customer service only became an issue when complaints started, coming to these overriding agencies. So, according to Chin et al. In a 2024 study, top leaders can play a pivotal role in mitigating by taking action. They have to take appropriate action, and when they don't do this, they create a permissible environment. And the way that they have to take action is they have to establish a desirable culture. They have to be very clear about what their goals and values are. They have to create healthy social norms. They have to foster a climate of psychological safety and an ability to sustain change. And they can only do that with consistency. None of these things existed over here. So we had a situation where, um, they did try, they did make some attempts. They implemented a series of middle managers at one point, to oversee activities. Those individuals were kind of acting like spies, just, I guess, to just sort of give information to the owner that this is happening and that's happening. But then the actions that were taken based on that were incongruent. Nothing made sense. There was a lot of flip flopping, and strangely, even though they were doing their job, there was a shoot the messenger kind of mentality. Anytime a complaint would come in, or the person would say, oh, this happened or that happened, they would suddenly be on the outs with the owner. So it was almost, they kind of learned, like, just always say everything is fine, even though nothing was fine. And so all of those middle managers actually left there at a very, within the first year of them working, because they just couldn't work in the environment. And the reason was top leadership was producing and sustaining a toxic culture where that toxic leadership could be maintained. That was the problem. And so the president had created a toxic culture that he had created a permissive culture with a lack of transparency and trust, and without clear expectations and true values of what they actually wanted. And in our interviews with him and our discussions and one-on-one sessions with him, a lot of this, according to him, came from his Egyptian culture. And according to him, this is how things were handled in his homeland. He said that he didn't want to fire her. Even though there was more than enough reason to remove an individual who just wasn't functioning optimally. But he said that they don't fire people in Egypt. I'm serious. He said this to me. He said that we don't fire anybody. We wait till they die. And I know that sounds a little funny, but I couldn't believe that he said that. But that's actually what was happening over here. There was no effort to actually change the behavior. And so it was, this issue was just proliferating for the longest time, for decades on decades, because progressive action and positive action was not being taken. So what was essentially happening there was a shoot the messenger kind of mentality. There was a lot of flip flopping on solutions. There was a lot of, when pushed push came to shove, the reaction from the owner would be to yell and berate in a similar manner to how that other individual was acting. And then when none of that worked, he would just leave and go to Egypt for 6 months at a time. And so then all of that behavior was able to continue because there was nobody monitoring. And basically, that's how this thing has continued for so many years. Um, all logic had gone out the window in terms of how to run a business, which is strange because he has very successful businesses, but they are not run on this kind of a model. So issues about like reprimands and termination, it was completely undermined because he had told the director, "Don't worry, you're never going to be fired. This is a lifetime position," and she had no fear. So even if she got yelled at every now and then that, "Hey, don't do that, don't whatever," it didn't matter. He was going to leave in a couple of days anyway, and then everything went back to her normal, or the toxic cultural norm of how things had always been done. So, from a biblical perspective, this organization had become like a lawless nation. So, according to Proverbs, a lawless nation will have many bad leaders. And I think that's like a perfect example of what was going on over here, because that it wasn't that there was one bad leader, the owner was also acting as a bad leader. You in a lawless nation, when there are no laws, when everything goes, where decisions are just sometimes, you make an impulsive decision, we're going to do this, and then the next day we're not going to do this, and it runs like a lawless nation. And so in a situation like this, um, the active toxic leadership flaws in the director were tolerated by passive toxicity seen in the president's actions and lack of action. So basically, it was a lawless nation with many bad leaders. That's what was going on in this organization. I thought that the scriptural quote was actually perfect, for what was happening over here. So there were no rules, and there were no clear rules or expectations of how to behave, and it allowed villainy to reign essentially. So what's the solution here? So there are a lot of different things that we're going to talk about. This is like our final solution. So the solution was to first identify that a toxic culture had been created by top leadership. So he needed to acknowledge this isn't stemming from one person, cannot blame one individual. Yes, they are displaying these traits, but it's allowed to occur. There's a permissible environment here. And the actions of top leadership are allowing this structure, this to occur within the cultural structure. So now that we have identified this, we have to choose the right solution for this kind of a culture. How do we do this? So there are a couple of different steps. The first was through leadership development. And like I said, because of the way that this individual had been placed in this position, they had no leadership skills to begin with, and they had not developed any. There was no training. And so a certain amount of training had to occur. And we did this through emotional intelligence training, an emotional intelligence training program. And we invested in leadership development programs that focused on fostering positive leadership behaviors and identifying toxic traits. The second was establishing clear values and expectations. Um, you know, and the owner had to display follow through. Like once you have established that this is what I'm expecting, you have to follow through with that. You can't flip flop. There has to be consistency. It cannot be an all talk, no walk sort of an organization. You have to walk the talk. And you also have to provide an example of it, um, and be very clearly defining your values and expectations for leadership. And it has to be consistently enforced. The third step is to promote open communication and transparency to identify toxic leadership behavior, or toxic behaviors by anyone in the organization. And the way that we decided to implement that is through having weekly meetings. For some reason, for the last almost 2 years, they had not had weekly meetings. They used to have weekly meetings, and they stopped doing that. And was a major problem, because it's in those meetings that you need to have a time and a place where you can actually discuss what happened in a, from the previous week, so it's relatively close to that event. Otherwise, things are just going to build up. So one thing happens, and another thing compounds, and so you have to address issues um, regularly and very close to the events in order to kind of create solutions and policies that work to prevent further proliferation of those kinds of issues. So weekly meetings was something that we implemented. The fourth was to encourage feedback and accountability. So like I said, there were no performance reviews being done. And we require now that performance reviews are done. And this gives employees a safe space so that they can actually provide feedback on leadership behaviors and hold leaders accountable for their actions. And the owner has to, take action. Cannot just create a permissible environment where everything goes, and then he leaves, and there's no consistency. There has to be checks and balances in terms of performance feedback. And then finally, our fifth step is addressing the toxic behaviors of this individual by having one-on-one meetings with them as well. So everybody in the organization needs to have performance reviews, but also one-on-one meetings allows leadership to explain, these are the steps, this is what I am expecting of you. And it has to be on a regular basis that there is this sort of one-on-one performance review. And if actions are not meeting if behaviors are not meeting expectations, then absolutely a system needs to be developed where one, the toxic leadership or the toxic behaviors in leadership are established, or explained, identified, and they have to be addressed directly. And you have to have a system where you can take appropriate disciplinary action. Without the ability to take disciplinary action, these things are just going to persist. So there has to be some logical steps in place in terms of, disciplinary action and eventual termination if the behaviors don't improve. So, you cannot have a policy, you're never going to be fired. This isn't an organization where it's not like a situation of tenure or something like that. So there was no like official policy. So there was no reason to even say something like that to this individual. There has to be that termination is a possibility. If there is no effort to improve, nothing is being done. And so the results of implementing these solutions, these steps, we found actually that behavior in the director improved almost overnight, primarily because this safety that she had, that she's never going to be fired, that was removed. And almost immediately when these rules were established, she realized that her job was on the line. And that was the motivation that she needed. We had to create a shape up or ship out kind of mentality, and it had to be backed by actual action. And now that that was an understood, established rule, she was being watched and she was being monitored, and there was feedback and there was performance that was being monitored, and action was going to be taken if those behaviors didn't change. So there was almost an immediate improvement. So that might have been the missing factor in all of this, possibly. Um, so, that mentality allowed for all of the rest of it to happen, in terms of even being able to do the training, for her to participate in the emotional intelligence training and the exercises. You have to be motivated to actually feel like, okay, I want to gain something from this training. Whereas in the past, I'm sure that there would be no motivation to change. So the training program was successful because there were, improvements seen in the pre-scores and post-scores, for the emotional intelligence and the surveys and the feedback. So we saw improvements, in all of those, in various parameters such as job satisfaction amongst the staff, morale, customer satisfaction amongst the clients. Uh, People started coming back to the business overall. Not only did the feedback improve, but patients' numbers started to improve because they started to see the changes that were occurring. And word of mouth improved. A lot of the recruitment efforts that just weren't getting anywhere, they started to suddenly, you started to see fruits from those efforts. And so right now we're in the process of monitoring, where we monitor for another year to make sure that there are long-term improvements and that these behavioral changes are sustained. That's part of what we do here in our consulting firm. So thanks for sticking with me and listening to our discussion about how to deal with these various issues in regards to this organization, and understanding how consulting psychologists work within organizations, and how they try and learn and produce change within the cultures that they are working in. So, my name is Aisha Esker, and I am speaking to you from Liberty University. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. Thank you so much for listening. Bye bye.